to Connecticut. There were two other reasons that I remember that morning so clearly as well. The day before, my daughter and I had attended the funeral of a family friend in Pennsylvania, and once I was done with my non-writing rituals, I intended to write about her, about the considerable inspiration that the lives of valiant older people provide us. I had gone straight from that funeral to a hospital where my closest friend was having cancer surgery that appeared to have been spectacularly successful. So while I have a great deal of trouble remembering almost anything at this moment in my life, while I once did a column tied to my age called Life in the 30s, I now say that the 50s version would be entitled, Where the Hell Did I Leave My Keys? I do remember how I felt that particular morning as I settled into the old Windsor chair at which I finally, finished with preliminaries, sit down to write. I felt painfully mortal, quite vulnerable, and enormously grateful. Over the course of the next few days, the entire city in which I work, the entire country in which I live, would come to feel much the same way. For me, there was a particular reason for gratitude as the horrible events of that day unspooled in a long, endless loop of cataclysmic news footage. When my husband called to tell me to turn on the television, we both thought there had been a freak accident. But as I watched the arc of that second plane as it smashed into the Trade Center towers, just a few miles south of our narrow Victorian row house, I knew that something uniquely terrible was taking place. I also had reason to believe that everyone I cared for most was safe. My husband across the Hudson at his office, the children at their schools, my friend in the hospital across town. It was difficult for us to talk to one another, of course, with the New York City telephone lines out, the tunnels and bridges shut down, and cyberspace hopelessly jammed. One of the mementos I have kept from that morning are 3 identical emails from our son at college, who could not get through on the day of his birthday or for 3 days afterwards. Each one is dated September 11th, 2001, and says in capital letters, I really need to hear your voice. The morning after, a new world burned and bloomed, too, beneath an incongruously cerulean sky. A group of my daughter's friends gathered in our kitchen and made hundreds of sandwiches and brownies to take to the Red Cross offices nearby. They bought enormous bags of dog food to bring to the local firehouse for their Dalmatians and the rescue dogs looking for survivors downtown. The familiar strangers in our neighborhood lingered on the street to speak to one another, to pass along the newest stories about the horror to the south and the people who knew people who'd been inside the Twin Towers. 2 days later, the wind changed, and the neighborhood smelled sharply of smoke. I know that smell, an old man who lived in the apartment house on the corner said in accented English, and someone told me he was a Holocaust survivor. Most nights, housebreaking the puppy we had picked up the day after our son left for school, I would run into a fireman who was heading home after working the wreckage, his eyes burning bright in a grimy face, his hands nicked and bandaged. He would pet our dog, rub her ears and muzzle, finally crouch to hold her squirmy little body close. And by the time he rose for the rest of the walk home, there would be bright tear tracks in the dirt on his face. I tried not to cry until he was gone. But despite the scent of death and the fighter planes flying low overhead and the interior rat-tat-tat of panic and fear, there was also that hidden gratitude, the feeling on the part of most New Yorkers that they might have been downtown, that they could have gone to a meeting or a breakfast, that they somehow were still alive. For me, that gratitude was also professional. The morning of September 12, 2001, I was at my desk first thing, no preliminaries, no computer games, seizing the chance to write about an event more destructive, more transformative, and more important than any I had ever written about during 3 decades as a journalist. And at that moment, I thanked God, not only for the safety of my family and friends, but for the gift of being permitted to do what I do for a living. It's a strange job covering and commenting on the news. Life washes over us as it does all our fellows, and yet we see it in a completely different way than they do. Disaster, tragedy, malfeasance, change, everything is always arranging itself into stories, making itself tidy and suitable for 900-word retellings. Nothing is too messy to be summed up in a headline or a soundbite. We are the people who go to wars with laptops instead of guns, who look at the scene of the crime without turning away, who stand in the flickering heat of a house fire and take down the details as someone jumps from a third-story window. We ask questions ordinary people would be ashamed to ask. We watch. That is our job. The greater the event, the larger the disconnect between what we feel as human beings and how we look at things dispassionately as reporters. I remember well arriving back in the city in 1977 after telling our families that we had become engaged, and emerging from the Holland Tunnel, not into the twinkle glare of the downtown streets, but into darkness limned with the foreboding shadows of buildings black on black, New York City absent all electrical power. For just an instant, I thought how amazingly different the place looked, how bright the stars, how dark the streets. But almost immediately, everything coalesced into a single thought. How big the story. I do not know any reporter who truly managed to feel that way about the events of September 11th, although all of us knew it was indeed the biggest story we would ever cover. It was also the one in which the human part of us stayed in the forefront, right there beside the notebook. The pain was too great, the loss too enormous, the shock too overwhelming. Most of my colleagues stayed whole during the days that followed, feeling the event and covering it at the same time. This is relatively rare, but in this case, absolutely necessary. Not only, I think, for the mental health of the reporters, but for the verisimilitude of the stories they produced. I have never been quite as proud of being in the business as I was during those dreadful days, when newspapers, magazines, and television all produced exemplary work. In the aftermath of the terrorist attacks, the New York Times would win more Pulitzers than it ever had, and Newsweek would be honored with the National Magazine Award for Best Magazine in its circulation class. This was no accident. The story of what happened to the people in those buildings and to the United States was so enormous that it called upon the best within all of us to respond. Some people did that by combing the wreckage, cooking for the rescue crews, setting up funds for widows and orphans. In my business, we did it by writing the truth, beautifully. For me personally, the opportunity to do this was something of an accident of timing. I had been in the newspaper business for many years, as a reporter, an editor, and finally a columnist. And while I had loved it almost insanely, I had always hoped someday to write novels. I'd managed to work on my fiction while I was a columnist. But eventually the challenge of keeping on top of the news, and on top of 3 young children and ricocheting wildly between the two, while trying to live in the invented world of fiction became too much for me. In 1995, I left the New York Times and, I thought, the world of journalism for good. One of the most enduring memories of my life will be of walking my last night down 43rd Street, past the globe lamps with the Old English logo glowing black against the white light. I felt as though a door had slammed at my back, and while I'd blown it shut myself, it was still not a good feeling. For the first year, I was a recovering journalist, not a recovered one. Occasionally, news would break out, and I would feel a frisson like a phantom limb. I know about that. I have some thoughts. And once one of the children, in that inimitable way children have, went to the heart of it when we were watching the report of a doctor murdered at an abortion clinic. "Who's going to write about this stuff now that you're gone?" he said, chewing thoughtfully on a fruit roll-up. But the children also agreed that what they called that look had disappeared. I had not even known